All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving deep into a topic that is really interesting and really relevant to how we process information in today's world. We're
Yeah.
talking about grievance epistemology.
Hmm.
Ever notice how some interviews you listen to are just so full of emotion,
Yeah.
where someone's really laying out how they've been wronged or how they've been, treated unfairly? Well, that's where this idea of grievance epistemology comes in.
Absolutely.
It's about how do we separate those really, really powerful feelings from what are the actual facts of a situation.
You're right on the money because we all have this natural tendency towards empathy. We want to feel for somebody when they're sharing something that is painful or when they're conveying, strong emotions like that. But sometimes that can make us a little bit less critical of the information that we're receiving.
So, we're so caught up in the emotion that we maybe aren't thinking as clearly as we could be.
Precisely. And that's particularly true when somebody is really skilled at using that emotion to kind of draw us in.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. Grievance epistemology, what is the core concept here?
So grievance epistemology it's a little more than just having a grievance. It's like this lens for understanding and presenting information where feelings are really front and center as the primary source of truth. And a lot of the narratives that you'll hear through this lens, they're carefully constructed to kind of prop up that truth.
Okay, so it's not just venting. It's not just like getting something off your chest. There's an actual strategy at play.
There is often.
Can you give us a real-world example so I can wrap my head around this?
Sure. So think about you're scrolling online and you see somebody who's ranting about a terrible experience they had with customer service.
Oh, yeah, I've seen those rants a million times.
Right. And think about how often those rants, they highlight the most outrageous parts of the interaction, maybe even exaggerating a bit, but they conveniently leave out any details that might make them seem less sympathetic to the audience. So what starts as a personal annoyance very quickly morphs into this huge saga of corporate injustice. And anybody who's reading that is just primed to take their side.
So they're controlling which details are amplified and which details are maybe left out.
Exactly. It's like choosing what parts of the story you're going to highlight to make sure that, your side comes across really strongly.
And that's deliberate.
Yeah, it can be.
This is fascinating.
It is.
It's like that saying, there's three sides to every story, yours, mine, and the truth. But with grievance epistemology, it sounds like those lines get really blurred.
Absolutely. And one of the sources we have today even points out that this tendency to kind of reframe personal grievances as these massive societal issues is a key part of the strategy.
Okay, so it's not just, my boss was a jerk to me today. It's the system is rigged against people like me.
Exactly. And it's very clever and kind of sneaky in a way.
Yeah, it is. It is. Why is that so effective, though?
Well, because it taps into this idea of shared injustice. If you already agree with the big picture, you're less likely to scrutinize all the little details. So by relating it to these larger power structures, it kind of bypasses some of our critical thinking.
It makes it feel bigger than just one person's experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so now I'm curious about the motivations behind this. Is it always about malice? Is it always about trying to take somebody down?
It's tempting to assume bad intentions, but it's really more nuanced than that. Sometimes it's just a coping mechanism,
Okay.
When someone feels powerless, it's a way to kind of regain a sense of control.
So not necessarily trying to harm the other person, but trying to make themselves feel better.
Right. Think about it. Our sources highlight a few kind of common motivations, revenge and emotional release. Those are definitely up there. There's a certain catharsis to publicly airing your grievances, especially if you feel like you've been silenced or ignored.
Right? That feeling of you hurt me. Now I'm going to hurt you back.
Yeah. Or even just that need to be heard.
To be validated.
Yes, exactly.
And we can't forget the internet's role in all of this. I mean, it's become a breeding ground for echo chambers where people find communities that just reinforce their existing beliefs, even if those beliefs are based on, a skewed or incomplete understanding of what actually happened.
Absolutely. The more time we spend in those echo chambers, the more entrenched we become in our own narratives. And the harder it is to have these, productive dialogues with people who hold different views.
So it's like building this fortress around yourself.
Yeah.
Shutting out any dissenting voices and just amplifying those grievances within that space.
Yeah, kind of creating that safe space where your perspective is always affirmed.
But that can't be healthy long term, can it?
Not really, because it prevents us from engaging with the complexity of the world and with perspectives that might challenge our own.
So now that we've laid the groundwork for grievance epistemology, I want to get into the nitty-gritty of how it actually plays out in interviews. Are there any telltale signs or strategies that we should be aware of as listeners?
Absolutely. And the sources we have today break down some really subtle but powerful techniques that are used in these types of interviews.
Okay, lay it on us.
So, for instance, watch out for loaded or leading questions that are designed to kind of elicit specific responses, ones that already align with the interviewer's bias.
So they're almost setting a trap for the interviewee.
In a way, yes, it's about leading them down a path to a predetermined conclusion.
Okay, so what else?
Another powerful tactic is leaning heavily on emotional testimony. You know those moments where somebody breaks down crying or their voice trembles with anger or they express profound hurt? It's really powerful stuff, and it's often used to trigger our empathy and make us more receptive to their message, even if we don't have all the facts.
Right, because we're humans and we respond to emotion.
Exactly, and while genuine emotion is obviously a natural part of any honest conversation, it's important to be aware of how it can be strategically deployed in this context.
It's almost like weaponizing emotion.
In a way.
So it sounds like we really need to be careful, listeners, especially when strong emotions are involved.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is key.
Now, before we go any further, I want to make sure we're all on the same page with a couple of terms you've used.
Sure. Happy to clarify.
So you've mentioned echo chambers a few times. Can you just give us a quick definition for those who might not be familiar with the term?
Of course. An echo chamber is basically an environment, often online, where you're primarily surrounded by information and opinions that confirm your existing beliefs. It's like this self-reinforcing loop where you rarely encounter opposing viewpoints.
Okay, and loaded questions. What makes a question loaded?
A loaded question is basically a question that contains a built-in assumption or bias. It's often designed to trap the respondent into confirming a particular viewpoint or admitting to something that they might not actually believe.
So it's not about genuine inquiry. It's about steering the conversation.
You got it.
Okay, that's really helpful. This is getting interesting.
It is, isn't it?
Now back to those tactics.
Oh, there are more. Let's talk about how they can sometimes create an echo chamber even within the interview itself.
Oh, okay. How does that work?
Well, by surrounding the interviewee with people who already agree with them, either through, selective guest choices or just by fostering an environment where only certain viewpoints are welcome.
So it's like they're curating this whole chorus of voices to amplify their message.
Precisely. And it creates this illusion of widespread agreement, and it shuts down any potential challenges to the narrative.
It's like building their own little world,
Yeah.
where their grievances reign supreme.
Mm.
What about us as listeners, though? Are we just sitting ducks for these manipulative tactics?
Not at all. Awareness is our greatest defense here. By understanding these mechanics of grievance epistemology, we can start to recognize the patterns and become more discerning listeners.
So it was like learning to spot the tricks.
Yeah, exactly. One of the sources makes a great point about paying attention to what's not being said. Are there any gaps in the story? Are there any alternative explanations that aren't even being considered?
It's like reading between the lines.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about doing our own research?
Absolutely. Don't underestimate the power of independent verification. Are there other sources that can back up what's being said? Or are we just taking one person's word as gospel?
So it's about thinking critically, not just letting ourselves be swayed by a really compelling story or, really strong emotions.
Right, because sometimes a well-crafted narrative can be just as persuasive as cold, hard facts.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the tactics and the motivations, but now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the bigger picture, the real-world implications of all of this. It's not just about isolated interviews, right?
No, it's much bigger than that.
This is about how this communication pattern shapes our entire social discourse.
Right. Think about how these patterns show up in online discussions, in political debates, even in our personal relationships.
It's almost like a virus, isn't it?
Yeah.
Spreading from person to person, infecting our conversations.
It can feel that way sometimes.
And the sources we're looking at today paint a pretty clear picture of the potential consequences. One of the most worrying, I think, is the polarization of audiences. As we retreat into our little echo chambers, surrounded by people who agree with us, we become less and less willing to engage with different perspectives.
Exactly. It creates these divides where we're no longer able to have these nuanced conversations.
We're building walls instead of bridges.
And that leads to another major consequence, the breakdown of constructive dialogue. If we're constantly fixated on who's right and who's wrong, on assigning blame and seeking retribution, there's no room for genuine understanding or compromise.
It becomes this battle of narratives, a competition to see who can garner the most sympathy, the most outrage, the most followers.
And that often leads to the reinforcement of negative belief systems. If our primary lens for understanding the world is through our grievances, we're more likely to see everything as a confirmation of our victimhood.
That's a scary thought.
It can be because it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where we only see what we expect to see and everything is interpreted through that lens.
It's like we're trapping ourselves in a cycle of negativity and resentment.
It can feel that way.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
This awareness of grievance epistemology isn't just about analyzing other people's communication styles. It's also about turning that lens inward and examining our own patterns.
That's right. It's about self-awareness.
Whoa, now we're getting personal.
Think about it. How many times have you found yourself in an online debate that quickly devolved into a shouting match, fueled by anger and resentment?
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Or maybe a workplace conflict where everyone was so focused on proving their point that no one was actually listening.
Or even in our personal relationships, where past hurts and grievances can become the dominant narrative preventing us from moving forward.
Exactly. Those patterns are everywhere, and recognizing them is the first step towards breaking free.
So this grievance epistemology stuff, it's not just an abstract concept. It's a tool we can use to improve our own communication and interactions.
Absolutely.
It's about becoming more self-aware, more critical of our own thought patterns, and more open to different perspectives.
And that's the power of this concept. It's not about dismissing genuine emotions or invalidating anyone's experiences. It's about recognizing that while emotions are incredibly powerful, they don't always equal truth.
It's about finding that balance between empathy and critical thinking.
Precisely.
We can acknowledge someone's pain and frustration without automatically buying into their entire narrative.
Right. And one of our sources poses a really thought-provoking question that I think gets to the heart of all this.
Okay, hit me with it.
It asks, how might this awareness of grievance epistemology change how we approach our own grievances?
Ooh, that is a good question. It's easy to spot these patterns in others, but much harder to recognize them in ourselves.
It is, but imagine a world where instead of instantly jumping to blame and anger, we take a moment to pause and ask ourselves, what's really going on here? Is my perspective the only valid one? Am I missing any crucial pieces of information?
It's about turning that critical lens inward.
Examining
our own motivations and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Because sometimes our grievances, while they may be valid, don't have to define us. They don't have to be the lens through which we see the entire world.
Maybe, just maybe, by approaching our own grievances with more awareness and understanding, we can start to break free from those cycles of negativity and polarization that seem to dominate so much of our public discourse these days.
What if, instead of always leading to division and conflict, grievances could become a starting point for constructive dialogue, a way to bridge those divides and find common ground?
Now, that is a powerful thought. It really makes you wonder if we can shift the narrative both individually and collectively. But before we get too carried away, I want to circle back to something we discussed earlier. The importance of recognizing those subtle tactics used in interviews. You mentioned loaded questions and emotional appeals. Are there any other red flags we should be on the lookout for?
Oh, absolutely. And they can be surprisingly subtle. One common tactic is the use of anecdotal evidence. Those personal stories or experiences that are meant to illustrate a point.
Right.
While anecdotes can be powerful and relatable, it's important to remember that they don't necessarily represent the whole picture.
It's like judging a whole restaurant based on one bad meal.
Exactly. Another thing to watch out for is the appeal to authority. This is where the interviewer or interviewee cites an expert or a study to lend credibility to their claims.
Okay.
While it's important to consider expert opinions, it's also crucial to examine their credentials, their potential biases, and whether their views are widely accepted within their field.
So don't just blindly accept something as true just because someone with a fancy title said it.
Exactly. Always ask yourself, who is this expert? What are their qualifications? And is their opinion representative of the broader consensus?
I'm starting to realize that this whole grievance epistemology thing is like detective work. We have to be constantly on the lookout for clues, scrutinizing the evidence, and piecing together the full story.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not about blindly accepting what we're told, but about engaging in that critical thinking process and forming our own informed conclusions.
Okay, so we've talked about the tactics, the consequences, even the introspective side of grievance epistemology. But how do we actually put all of this knowledge into practice? How can we use this awareness to navigate those tricky real-world situations?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive. It's all about taking this knowledge and applying it to everyday situations, right? Like when you're having, a discussion online, or maybe there's conflict at work, or even in your personal relationships. Think back to those red flags we talked about earlier, those loaded questions, those appeals to emotion, those carefully selected bits of evidence. If you can spot those tactics, it can really help you stay grounded and not get pulled into the emotional undertow.
So it's like having a checklist in your mind.
Yeah.
Okay, are they using loaded language? Are they trying to manipulate me with emotion? Are they giving me the whole picture or just a sliver?
Exactly. And if you see those red flags popping up, that's your cue to take a step back and really engage that critical thinking part of your brain.
Start asking those tough questions.
Yeah, like what's the evidence behind that claim? Is there another side to this story that we're not hearing?
So it's about having a healthy dose of skepticism, not just taking everything at face value.
And it's not about dismissing people's feelings or saying their experiences aren't valid. It's more about remembering that feelings don't always equal facts.
Right, finding that balance between empathy and critical thinking. We can recognize that someone's hurting or frustrated without having to agree with everything they're saying.
Exactly. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen. Really listen without judgment or interrupting. Often people just want to feel heard and validated.
But validating someone doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with them, right?
No, not at all. It's about showing them that you understand where they're coming from, that you're trying to see things from their perspective.
It's about making space for open and honest conversation, even when it's tough.
And you never know, that act of listening might actually lead to finding some common ground.
It's like they say, seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Right on. And this whole thing about navigating grievances, it's not just about other people. It's about turning that same lens inward and examining our own patterns.
That's right, that self-awareness piece.
Exactly. So the next time you feel like you've been wronged or treated unfairly, try taking a moment to just pause and reflect.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what's really at the core of this grievance? Is my perspective the only right one? Are my emotions clouding my judgment?
It's so easy to get wrapped up in our own stories, especially when we're feeling hurt or betrayed.
It is. But if you can take that step back, examine your own assumptions and biases, you can start to untangle those emotional knots and see things more clearly.
So maybe if we approach our own grievances with more awareness and understanding, we can break out of those cycles of negativity and resentment that can be so damaging.
Instead of feeling like a victim, you can feel empowered to find a resolution.
That's a powerful shift in mindset.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to that thought-provoking question we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
What if grievances, instead of always leading to division and conflict, could actually be a catalyst for positive change?
It's definitely something to think about. What if we started seeing grievances not as obstacles, but as opportunities for growth, for dialogue, for understanding?
What if we could use that energy to find solutions to build bridges instead of walls?
That's a vision worth striving for.
It really is. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to come back to something we were discussing earlier.
Right.
Recognizing those subtle tactics that people use in interviews. You mentioned loaded questions and emotional appeals, but are there any other red flags that we should be on the lookout for?
Oh yeah, there are a bunch, and they can be pretty sneaky. One that's really common is the use of anecdotal evidence. Those personal stories and experiences that are meant to illustrate a point.
Sure.
Now, anecdotes can be really powerful and relatable, but it's important to remember that they don't always show the whole picture.
It's like you said before, judging a whole restaurant based on one bad meal.
Exactly.
Mm.
Another thing to watch out for is the appeal to authority. This is where the interviewer or the interviewee might name drop an expert or a study to make their claims sound more credible. And while it's good to consider expert opinions, it's also important to look into their credentials. Are they biased? Is their opinion generally accepted in their field?
So don't just automatically believe something because someone with a fancy title said it.
Exactly. Do your own research. Figure out who this expert is, what their qualifications are, and if their opinion is actually representative of a broader consensus.
The more we talk about this grievance epistemology stuff, the more I realize it's like detective work. We have to be on the lookout for clues, examine the evidence, and try to piece together the whole story ourselves.
And that's what makes it so interesting. It's not about just accepting what we're told. It's about thinking critically and forming our own conclusions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the tactics, the consequences, and how this all applies to our own personal grievances. But how do we actually put all of this knowledge into practice? How can we use this awareness to navigate those tricky, real-world situations where grievances are bound to pop up?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive. It's about taking all this knowledge, right, and actually using it, out there in the real world,
Right.
where you're going to find grievances popping up everywhere you look.
Okay.
Think about like online, those heated debates that go nowhere,
Yeah.
or when conflict pops up at work, or
Right.
even in your personal relationships. Remember those red flags we talked about?
Oh, yeah, those loaded questions, those appeals to emotion.
Right, and that super selective evidence people use to try to make their point. If you can learn to spot those tactics, it's going to make you a much more savvy listener.
It's like having those tools in your back pocket so you don't get pulled into the drama.
Yeah, you'll be able to keep a clear head.
So if you're in the middle of a conversation and those red flags start waving,
Right.
that's your signal to take a step back.
Yeah.
Take a deep breath and engage that critical thinking.
Ask yourself, is this person using loaded language?
Right. Are they giving you the whole picture?
Are they trying to play on my emotions?
It's about having a healthy dose of skepticism,
Yeah.
not just believing everything you hear.
Because a good story can be just as persuasive as facts sometimes.
And it's not about saying that other people's experiences aren't valid
Right.
or that their feelings aren't real.
It's more about remembering that feelings don't always tell the whole story.
It's about that balance,
Yeah.
empathy and critical thinking.
Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just listen,
Really listen.
without judgment, without interrupting.
People just want to be heard.
Yeah, sometimes that's all it takes.
But validating someone isn't the same as agreeing with them, is it?
No, not at all.
It's more about letting them know you hear them.
Right, showing them that you're making an effort to understand where they're coming from.
It's about opening that door for dialogue.
Yeah, even when it's uncomfortable.
You never know, that active listening might actually lead to some common ground.
It might.
It's like they say, seek first to understand, then to be understood.
That's it. And this whole idea of navigating grievances, it's not just about other people.
Right.
It's about how we deal with our own grievances, too.
That self-awareness piece?
Exactly. So the next time you feel like you've gotten a raw deal or like you've been mistreated,
Yeah.
take a moment to just stop and think.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what's really going on here? Am I seeing the whole picture, or is it just my side of the story?
It's so easy to get caught up in our own heads.
Yeah, especially when we're feeling hurt.
When you feel wronged.
But if you can take a step back, question your own assumptions, you can start to see things more clearly.
Untangle those emotional knots.
Yeah, and maybe break free from those cycles of negativity and resentment.
That can be so toxic.
They can.
So instead of feeling like a victim, you can become empowered to actually find a solution.
Right.
That's a big shift.
It is.
And it takes me back to that question we asked earlier.
Mm-hmm.
What if, instead of always leading to conflict and division, grievances could actually be a springboard for something positive?
It's a great question to think about.
What if we started seeing those grievances as opportunities?
Yeah, like opportunities for growth.
To build understanding.
To have real dialogue.
It's about shifting our mindset.
From I'm a victim to I can make a difference.
That's powerful.
It is.
And it starts with each one of us. Being aware of our own biases, being willing to have those tough conversations, and looking for common ground.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
We're all learning and growing.
And it's important to stay curious.
Keep asking questions.
Never stop learning.
Right.
So for everyone listening out there, remember everything we talked about today. The next time you encounter a grievance, whether you're listening to an interview, scrolling through social media, or dealing with conflict in your own life, remember to look for those subtle tactics, question the narratives, and approach the situation with empathy and critical thinking.
Be willing to look beyond the surface.
You might be surprised at what you find.
You might.
And you might even inspire others to do the same.
That's the goal.
That's all for today's deep dive into grievance epistemology. Thanks for joining us, and keep those brains buzzing.